She is just a useless nobody who will never build a career or amount to anything. Those were the exact words my father chose to announce to a room full of people at my brother's extravagant 35th birthday party. He had just handed his golden boy the keys to a $15 million Beverly Hills mansion, while my mother and sister-in-law laughed at my expense. They thought I was just a broke administrative assistant who could barely afford to exist in their high society world. What they did not know was that the very roof over their heads, the companies they bragged about, and the ground they stood on, all secretly belonged to me. By the time I walked out of that restaurant, the newly released Forbes billionaire list would expose my secret and my toxic family would lose absolutely everything. Wait, she is the one who paid for all of this. My mother's face turned completely white as the entire table went dead silent. My name is Natalie, 33 years old, and for my entire life, I have been the designated disappointment in a family obsessed with the illusion of wealth. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who completely underestimated your worth and treated you like a burden. The crystal chandeliers of the French Laundry cast a warm and golden glow over the private dining room, but the atmosphere at our table was anything but warm. I sat quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table, sipping my sparkling water, feeling the familiar and suffocating weight of my family's harsh judgment. Tonight was all about Derek. My older brother was turning 35, and in the eyes of our parents, he was the undisputed king of the world and the brilliant future of the family business. Honestly, Natalie, did you really have to park that ancient Toyota right in the front lot? Naomi's voice sliced through the gentle hum of classical music playing in the background. My sister-in-law, a stunning African-American woman draped in an emerald green silk gown, looked at me with open and unfiltered disdain. She aggressively adjusted the massive diamond ring on her finger, making sure it caught the light from the chandelier above us. The valet actually looked embarrassed for you when you handed him the keys. You are completely ruining the aesthetic of Derek's big night with your poverty mindset. It gets me from point A to point B, Naomi, I replied evenly, keeping my face perfectly blank and my voice devoid of any emotion. I did not bother to mention that the rusted Toyota was just a decoy. My actual daily driver, a fully armored custom Maybach, was safely parked in an underground high-security garage 3 states away in New York. Point A to point B. Derek scoffed loudly, swirling his $400 glass of imported Cabernet. He wore a bespoke Italian suit that strained slightly around his waist, acting every bit the successful corporate titan he pretended to be. That is exactly your problem, Natalie. You have absolutely no vision and zero drive. You are 33 years old and still doing mindless administrative paperwork in some windowless office for a boss who probably does not even know your name. You need to start thinking bigger, or you are going to be renting that cramped, pathetic little apartment of yours forever. My mother, Susan, sighed dramatically from the other end of the table, dabbing her perfectly powdered nose with a crisp linen napkin. Let us not talk about Natalie's embarrassing career tonight, Derek. It is simply too depressing and lowers the mood of the room. We are here to celebrate your genius. Your father and I are just so incredibly proud of the man you have become. The family business is thriving entirely because of your leadership. I took another slow sip of water, hiding my deep amusement behind the crystal glass. The family business she was bragging about was my father's mid-tier logistics company, a sinking ship that had been bleeding massive amounts of capital for half a decade. Derek, the supposed genius vice president, spent far more time playing golf and leasing luxury cars on the company's dwindling dime than actually looking at financial statements. But in this family, facts simply did not matter. Only the grand illusion of wealth mattered. "Listen to your mother," my father Richard boomed from the head of the table. At 65, he still carried himself like an untouchable titan of industry, his silver hair slicked back perfectly, his heavy gold Rolex flashing aggressively as he raised his wine glass. Derek has the instinct. He has the killer drive that it takes to survive and dominate in modern America. It is a genetic trait. Some of us have it. He paused, his cold eyes locking onto mine with unvarnished contempt. And some of us are just genetic dead weight, dragging the rest of the bloodline down. The cruelty in his words was not new. It was a well-rehearsed script they had been reciting since I was a teenager, but the bluntness of it still hung heavy in the opulent room. Naomi let out a soft and musical laugh, leaning her head affectionately against Derek's shoulder. "Well," she murmured, taking another sip of her wine, "at least she showed up to celebrate her betters, Richard. We should definitely give her some credit for basic attendance." I did not blink. I did not attempt to defend myself. I just let their bitter words wash right over me, silently cataloging every single insult and every arrogant sneer. They genuinely thought they had me perfectly figured out. They thought I was the weak link, the fragile scapegoat they could endlessly kick around to make their own miserable lives feel grand and important. They had absolutely no idea that the windowless office they kept mocking was actually the penthouse executive suite of Vanguard Apex in downtown Manhattan. They had no idea that I had not come to this dinner to celebrate my brother at all. I had come to watch their fake empire burn to the ground. "Anyway," Richard said, loudly dismissing my entire existence with a careless wave of his hand, as if he were swatting away an annoying fly. "Enough about failures and dead ends. Let us talk about real success." He stood up from his chair at the head of the table and picked up a silver butter knife, tapping it gently against his crystal champagne flute. The clear, sharp ringing sound demanded the absolute attention of everyone in the private dining room. "I want to propose a toast," my father announced, his chest puffed out with immense pride. "To my son Derek, 35 years old today and already a towering figure in the corporate world. When I started my logistics firm 40 years ago, I dreamed of building a lasting legacy. I dreamed of passing the torch to a man who understood the brutal reality of the American market. Derek, you are that man. You have the killer instinct." Derek smiled smugly, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Thank you, Dad. I just do what needs to be done to keep the family name at the very top. And you do it flawlessly." Richard continued, raising his glass higher. "Just look at the way you handled that new supply chain contract last quarter. Pure brilliance. You secured our financial future for the next decade." I pressed my lips together to stop myself from laughing out loud. The supply chain contract he was boasting about was an absolute disaster. Derek had accidentally signed away 30% of their profit margins to a third-party vendor because he was too busy playing golf at the local country club to actually read the binding terms and conditions. The only reason the company had not filed for bankruptcy yet was because I had secretly injected capital into their accounts through a blind trust, a safety net I was planning to rip away very soon. Richard turned his gaze back to me, and the warm pride in his eyes instantly dissolved into ice-cold disappointment. "You see, Natalie, this is what actual hard work looks like." Derek did not waste his life hiding behind a cheap desk. He went out there and conquered. He networked with the elite. He built a beautiful life with a stunning wife who understands the value of high society. Naomi preened at the compliment, smoothing down her designer gown. "It takes a certain caliber of woman to stand beside a successful man," she said, looking directly at me with a pitying smirk. "It is a shame you never learned how to elevate yourself, Natalie. A woman your age should be married, building an asset portfolio, or at least dressing like she respects herself. That polyester blouse you are wearing is practically screaming minimum wage." Susan chimed in, nodding in total agreement with her daughter-in-law. "Naomi is completely right, Natalie. We try to set a good example for you, but you refuse to learn. You have always been so stubbornly committed to mediocrity." We practically handed you the blueprint for a successful upper-class life, and you threw it away to become a nobody. I kept my expression completely neutral, cutting a small piece of roasted asparagus. You are right, Mom, I said calmly. I definitely chose a completely different path than Derek. Richard scoffed loudly, sitting back down in his chair. That is the understatement of the century. Your path led straight to the bottom of the food chain. But enough about your lack of ambition. Tonight is about rewarding excellence. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket. Derek, my boy, your mother and I wanted to get you something truly spectacular for your milestone birthday. Something that perfectly matches your elite status and proves to the world exactly who you are. The entire table leaned in closer, their eyes wide with greedy anticipation. Richard pulled out a heavy, beautifully polished mahogany box and pushed it slowly across the white tablecloth directly toward my brother. The grand climax of their ridiculous charade was finally about to begin. Derek reached out with trembling hands and unlatched the gold clasp of the mahogany box. He flipped the lid open, and a collective gasp echoed around the dining table. Resting on a bed of black velvet was a single heavy silver key, adorned with a leather tassel alongside a thick stack of glossy legal documents. Derek stared at the contents completely speechless for the first time in his arrogant life. Naomi practically leaned over her husband's shoulder, her eyes wide and hungry as she scanned the top page of the paperwork. Happy 35th birthday, my son Richard announced, his chest expanding with absolute triumph. You are looking at the deed and the master key to a $15 million estate in the heart of Beverly Hills. It boasts 6 bedrooms, an infinity pool overlooking the city, and a private wine cellar. It is officially yours, Derek, fully secured and ready for you and Naomi to move in by the end of the month. The private dining room erupted into applause. Susan clapped her hands together, tears of joy streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Naomi let out a high-pitched squeal, throwing her arms around Derek's neck and kissing him fiercely. Oh my goodness, Derek, we finally have our dream house, Naomi gasped, fanning her face with her manicured hand. I cannot wait to hire an interior designer. We are going to throw the most incredible parties. The country club girls are going to absolutely lose their minds when they see the view from our new terrace. This is exactly what we deserve for all our hard work. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting quietly in my lap. I watched them celebrate their massive and glittering lie. It took every ounce of my self-control to keep my face completely passive. A $15 million estate in Beverly Hills. I knew the exact property Richard was talking about. It was located on Oak Pass Road, a stunning piece of modern architecture featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls and a wraparound driveway. I knew all of these intimate details because Vanguard Apex, my secret company, had acquired that exact property 6 months ago as part of a massive luxury portfolio buyout. Richard had not bought that house outright. My father's struggling logistics company did not possess anywhere near $15 million in liquid cash. I knew exactly what he had done. He had leveraged the last remaining assets of his failing business to secure a desperate and high-interest bridge loan directly from Vanguard Apex, using a shell corporation to hide his identity. He had paid a fraction of the cost as a non-refundable deposit just to get the keys tonight and maintain his fake billionaire persona for his favorite son. It was a spectacular financial suicide mission, and he was completely oblivious to the fact that the invisible chief executive officer pulling the strings on the other side of that ruthless contract was the very daughter he was actively humiliating. This is what real power looks like, Richard said loudly, his voice cutting through the celebratory chatter. He stood tall, holding his glass of champagne, soaking in the admiration of his wife and his daughter-in-law. When you dedicate yourself to building a legacy, when you refuse to settle for the bottom of the barrel, the world rewards you. This house is a testament to the superior DNA of this family. We do not just survive, we conquer the elite. Susan reached across the table and squeezed Richard's hand affectionately. You have provided so beautifully for this family, Richard. Derek and Naomi are going to raise our future grandchildren in a palace. It is nothing short of a modern American fairy tale. Naomi picked up the heavy silver key, holding it up to the chandelier light as if it were a holy relic. She then slowly turned her gaze toward me, her lips curling into a vicious and mocking smile. You know, Natalie. Naomi purred, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. We will definitely need to hire a full-time housekeeping staff for a property this massive, someone to scrub the imported marble floors and clean the infinity pool. Since you are so comfortable living paycheck to paycheck and have zero actual career prospects, maybe Derek and I could offer you a job. We could even let you live in the tiny guest quarters above the garage. It would be a huge upgrade from your current living situation. Derek burst into loud and cruel laughter, pounding his fist on the table. Oh, that is brilliant, Naomi. We could give her a cute little uniform and everything. What do you say, little sister? Do you want to be the official maid of the new Beverly Hills mansion? I will even pay you minimum wage plus tips if you do a really good job making my bed. I looked directly into my brother's eyes, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. The image of Derek strutting around a property I owned, pretending to be a king while suffocating under predatory interest rates, was almost too poetic to interrupt. That is a very generous offer, Derek. I replied, my voice perfectly steady. But I think I will pass. I prefer my current living situation. Richard slammed his palm flat against the table, rattling the expensive silverware and drawing concerned glances from the waitstaff standing near the private room doors. Stop indulging her, Derek, my father barked, his face flushing with sudden and intense anger. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at my chest. Do you hear how she speaks? So arrogant, so ungrateful. You offer her a lifeline, a chance to finally be around real wealth and success, and she turns her nose up at it as if she actually has options. This is exactly why you will never be anything more than a useless paper pusher, Natalie. The entire room seemed to quiet down, the ambient chatter from the main dining area fading away as my father's voice escalated. He was entirely in his element, using my perceived failure as a stepping stone to elevate his own fragile ego. You sit in that pathetic little cubicle of yours, stamping meaningless documents for people who actually matter. He continued, his tone dripping with absolute venom. You have no drive. You have no killer instinct. You are 33 years old and you have absolutely nothing to show for your existence. Look at your brother. He is securing multi-million-dollar contracts for the family business. He is moving into a Beverly Hills estate that most people cannot even dream of walking past. And what are you doing? You are driving a rust bucket and living in a shoebox. You are a complete and total embarrassment to the family name. I kept my posture completely straight, resting my hands quietly in my lap. The venom in his voice was meant to shatter me, to reduce me to the small, insecure child I used to be. But the woman sitting across from him was not a frightened child anymore. I was a chief executive officer who controlled billions in liquid assets, and his pathetic words simply bounced off my invisible armor. Dad, there is no need to shout, I said calmly, taking a slow breath. I am just here to eat dinner and celebrate the birthday. Do not you dare tell your father to lower his voice, Susan snapped instantly, jumping to Richard's defense. My mother leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with sharp and vicious disapproval. Your father is simply giving you the tough love you so desperately need, Natalie. Someone has to give you a harsh reality check before you waste the rest of your miserable life. We have tried everything with you. We paid for the best private tutors, we tried to get you into the right social circles, we practically begged you to marry a man with a respectable investment portfolio. But you insisted on being difficult and independent. And look where that independence got you. Absolutely nowhere. I glanced at my mother, maintaining my emotionless facade. Tough love, Mom, I asked softly. Is that what we are calling public humiliation now? Yes, that is exactly what we are calling it, Susan replied coldly, aggressively, adjusting the expensive pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. You need to understand the stark difference between you and your brother. Derek is a natural-born winner. He took the golden opportunities we gave him and he multiplied them. He built a beautiful, enviable life with Naomi. You, on the other hand, have squandered every single advantage you were ever given. You actively chose to be a nobody. So do not sit there and act like a victim when your father points out the obvious truth. You are entirely responsible for your own pathetic financial situation. Naomi chimed in, swirling the last drop of expensive wine in her crystal glass. Honestly, Susan, I do not know how you handle the constant disappointment. If I had a daughter who showed up to a high-class restaurant looking like she just got off a double shift at a local diner, I would be absolutely mortified. It is just so deeply disrespectful to the incredible high society lifestyle you and Richard have worked so hard to build. It is emotionally exhausting. Naomi Susan agreed, letting out a heavy theatrical sigh that echoed across the table. We try to include her, we really do. We invite her to these extravagant dinners because she is blood, but sometimes I truly wonder why we even bother trying. She brings down the entire mood with her negative energy and her complete lack of ambition. Richard raised his glass one more time, his eyes locked on mine with cold and brutal finality. Let this be a lasting lesson to you, Natalie. The real world does not reward mediocrity. It rewards power, it rewards ruthless intelligence, and it rewards massive success. These are concepts you clearly know absolutely nothing about. Now let us stop wasting our expensive breath on a lost cause. He turned his attention back to his golden child, completely dismissing my presence from his reality. Drink up, Derek. My father cheered brightly, his foul mood vanishing instantly as he smiled warmly at his favorite son. Tonight is about celebrating the real future of this family empire. As they clinked their expensive glasses together in a joyous chorus, I quietly reached into my handbag and felt the cold, hard edge of my primary mobile phone. The trap had been set perfectly, and they had just gleefully walked right into the center of it. The joyous chorus of clinking glasses faded into the background as the waitstaff began clearing the final dessert plates. The extravagant birthday dinner was finally drawing to a close. I left my primary phone in my handbag, letting my fingers trace the smooth metal casing for just a moment longer before resting my hands quietly back on the table. The trap was ready, but I needed to let them play their final hand first. The heavy wooden doors of the private dining room swung open and the head waiter approached the head of the table. He carried a sleek black leather folder, the kind that held the immense financial damage of a night spent consuming vintage champagne and imported caviar. He stepped respectfully toward my father, holding the folder out with a practiced smile. Richard did not even look at the waiter. He was too busy admiring the silver key to the Beverly Hills mansion he had just gifted his favorite son. He waved his hand dismissively in the air. "Give that to my wife," he instructed loudly. "Susan handles the minor administrative details of the evening. I have much larger investments to think about right now." The waiter smoothly pivoted and offered the black leather folder to my mother. Susan took it with a graceful nod, but she did not open it to examine the total. Instead, she let her manicured fingers rest on the cover for a brief second, before deliberately sliding it across the crisp white tablecloth. The folder glided smoothly past the extravagant floral centerpieces and came to a complete stop directly in front of me. I stared down at the black leather, keeping my face perfectly unreadable. I did not reach for it right away. I simply shifted my gaze back to my mother, waiting for the inevitable punchline to her cruel joke. "Go ahead, Natalie," Susan said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and undeniable authority. "Open it." I reached out and flipped the cover open. The itemized receipt was 3 pages long, detailing every single bottle of $1,000 wine, the imported white truffles, the premium Wagyu beef, and the exclusive flat fee for renting the private dining room for the entire evening. At the very bottom, printed in bold black ink, was the grand total. Exactly $50,000. I closed the folder quietly and placed my hands neatly in my lap. "Are you asking me to split the bill with you, Mom?" I asked, my voice remaining perfectly level. Because as you can see, I only ordered a sparkling water and a side of roasted asparagus. Susan let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Split it. Do not be ridiculous, Natalie. I am asking you to pay it. The entire thing. It is the absolute least you can do for us. I raised an eyebrow, maintaining my calm exterior, despite the intense heat rising in the room. $50,000 is the least I can do, I asked, genuinely amazed by the sheer audacity of her demand. You want me, the supposedly useless paper pusher, to cover a $50,000 dinner tab? Susan nodded firmly, her expression hardening into absolute seriousness. Yes, I do. We have provided you with a roof over your head for 18 years. We clothed you, we fed you, and we gave you the prestigious family name you carry today. You have done absolutely nothing to earn your keep since you became an adult. Tonight is your brother's monumental 35th birthday. We just bought him a $15 million estate. It is your basic duty as a member of this family to show a little gratitude and cover the dinner. Naomi scoffed loudly from across the table, shaking her head in theatrical disbelief. Exactly, Susan. She lives in that cramped little apartment and drives that rusty old Toyota. She has no children, no husband, and no real expenses to worry about. She must have thousands of dollars just sitting in a basic savings account gathering dust. It is incredibly selfish of her to sit here and hoard her pennies, while the rest of us are busy building a legacy for the next generation. You heard your sister-in-law, my father chimed in, leaning back in his chair with a highly satisfied smirk. Stop acting so stingy, Natalie. Dingy. You are embarrassing yourself in front of the staff. Pull out whatever cheap little debit card you have and take care of the check. Consider it your contribution to Derek's success. It is the only valuable thing you will ever do for him in your entire life. They were entirely serious. They fully expected me, the daughter they had spent the last 2 hours violently degrading, to somehow produce $50,000. I looked from my father's incredibly smug face to my mother's expectant glare, and finally down to the absurd $50,000 bill sitting on the table. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not reach for my purse. No, I said softly. The single word hung in the air, instantly freezing the warm atmosphere of the room. Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into two dangerous slits. What did you just say to me? I said no, I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly steady and loud enough for everyone to hear. I am not paying for a party I never wanted to attend for a brother who openly despises me to celebrate a house he cannot actually afford. If you wanted a free ride tonight, you invited the wrong daughter. Susan gasped loudly, pressing a manicured hand to her chest, as if she had just been physically struck. The sheer disrespect, she cried out, looking around the table for immediate support. We raised a completely ungrateful monster. Derek slammed his fist on the table again, his face turning a blotchy and furious shade of red. You are pathetic, Natalie. You cannot even do this one simple thing for your own family. You are probably just terrified because your sad little bank account does not even have enough zeros to cover the appetizer course. That was when Naomi decided to insert herself completely into the conflict. She leaned back in her plush chair, crossing her arms tightly over her expensive emerald gown, and let out a long, mocking sigh. "Oh, Derek, calm down," she said, waving a hand dismissively at her husband. "Do not be so hard on her. It is not her fault she is completely broke. We are asking a woman who shops at discount department stores to comprehend high society dining. Look at her shoes, for heaven's sake. They are practically held together by cheap glue and pure desperation." Naomi turned her sharp and calculating gaze directly on me, her eyes filled with unapologetic pity. "You know, Natalie, I used to feel sorry for you. I truly did. As a Black woman who had to claw her way to the top to secure a place in this elite circle, I know exactly what it takes to grind and build a successful empire. I thought maybe you just needed some proper guidance. But now I realize you are just incredibly lazy. You have absolutely no ambition. You are completely content being a bottom feeder in a family of sharks." She held up her left hand gracefully, letting the chandelier light reflect blindingly off her massive diamond ring. "Do you know what it takes to wear something like this?" It takes leverage. It takes knowing your ultimate worth and demanding the world give it to you. You sit in your tiny apartment eating cheap takeout and driving a car that looks like it belongs in a city junkyard, while Derek and I are out here securing generational wealth. We are moving into a Beverly Hills mansion while you are probably worrying about how you are going to pay your heating bill next month. Naomi let out another soft and vicious laugh, shaking her head. It actually makes perfect sense that you will not pay the bill. You physically cannot. If you handed the head waiter your debit card right now, the machine would probably catch fire from being declined so hard. You are an absolute embarrassment to your parents, to your brother, and honestly to yourself. If I were you, I would simply stand up, apologize for ruining the evening, and walk out the back door before the staff calls security on you for loitering. I let her finish her entire speech. I let her bask in her own toxic arrogance, absorbing every single vicious insult without a single change in my expression. Naomi was incredibly smart about many things, but she was completely blind to the reality standing right in front of her. She thought she had successfully clawed her way to the top of the food chain by marrying my brother. She had no idea she had simply chained herself to a sinking ship, covered in cheap gold paint. "You are very observant, Naomi," I said calmly, taking another small sip of my sparkling water. "I definitely do not have the kind of money that Derek supposedly has. So since he is the brilliant vice president of a thriving logistics empire, and since he is the proud new owner of a $15 million estate, I highly suggest the billionaire of the hour handles his own birthday tab." I gently pushed the black leather folder across the crisp tablecloth until it rested directly in front of my brother. Derek stared at the total, his jaw clenching tight as the waiter hovered nearby. He absolutely hated being challenged, especially in front of his demanding wife and our prideful parents. The bait was set perfectly. Now all he had to do was try to prove me wrong. Derek let out a sharp bark of laughter, shaking his head, as if I had just told the most ridiculous joke in the world. He looked at Naomi, then at our parents, exchanging deeply knowing smirks. "It is honestly sad, Natalie," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You are so intensely intimidated by real money that you cannot even handle looking at a restaurant bill. But fine. If you want to sit there and act like a petulant child throwing a tantrum over a few $1,000s, I will step up and be the adult, like I always do." He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek designer wallet. With a dramatic and arrogant flick of his wrist, he produced a heavy metal card and tossed it onto the silver tray the waiter was patiently holding. It was a black centurion card, the ultimate status symbol for the ultra-wealthy. The heavy metal made a sharp, satisfying clink as it hit the tray. "Take care of it," Derek told the waiter with a dismissive wave of his hand. "And add a 20% tip for yourself. I know dealing with my sister can be an exhausting experience for the service staff." The waiter bowed his head politely, picking up the tray. "Right away, sir," he murmured, turning on his heel and walking gracefully out of the private dining room. As soon as the heavy wooden doors clicked shut, the barrage of praise immediately began. Susan clapped her hands together, softly beaming at her son with absolute adoration. "That was incredibly generous of you, Derek. You always know exactly how to handle these awkward family situations with such immense class and dignity." Naomi leaned over and kissed him passionately on the cheek. "That is my billionaire husband," she purred, shooting me a highly triumphant glare. "You see, Natalie, that is what a real man does. He provides. He does not flinch at a $50,000 dinner tab because he knows his valuable time is worth 10 times that amount. You should really be taking notes instead of sitting there pouting like a jealous teenager." Richard nodded in absolute agreement, swirling the last dark bit of wine in his crystal glass. "You handled that perfectly, son. Let her sit in her own shame. When you are operating on our high level, you do not let bottom feeders drag you down into their petty financial anxieties. We are moving forward, building the empire, expanding our assets. 50 grand is nothing but pocket change to a man who just secured a $15 million estate." I sat perfectly still, letting them build their fragile tower of ego higher and higher. I did not say a single word in my own defense. I simply watched the second hand on the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticking away. I knew exactly what was happening at the cashier station out front. I knew the exact sequence of events unfolding inside the automated financial systems of Vanguard Apex. A few tense minutes passed. The atmosphere in the room quickly returned to a celebratory state. Derek and Naomi were already intensely discussing which luxury car they should purchase to park in the massive wraparound driveway of their new Beverly Hills home. Susan was excitedly planning a lavish housewarming party and rapidly listing off the influential socialites she intended to invite. Then the heavy wooden doors of the private dining room swung open. The head waiter stepped back inside, but this time his practiced and polite smile was entirely gone. Approached the head of the table. "Is there?" Approached the head of the table. "Is there a problem?" Derek asked, looking deeply annoyed by the sudden interruption. "I told you to add a 20% tip. Just run the card and bring me the receipt to sign. We have far better places to be tonight." The waiter swallowed hard, stepping closer to Derek and lowering his voice respectfully. "Sir, I sincerely apologize, but there seems to be a serious issue with your payment method." Derek frowned, his arrogant facade cracking just a tiny fraction of an inch. "An issue? What kind of issue? Did you swipe it incorrectly?" "It is a heavy metal card. Sometimes those outdated machines have trouble reading the chip. Just type the numbers in manually and stop wasting my time." "I did type the numbers in manually, sir." The waiter replied, his tone remaining strictly professional, but undeniably tense. "I tried the smart chip, the magnetic stripe, and the manual entry. The system gave me the exact same response every single time. Your card has been declined." The word hung heavily in the air like a sudden crack of thunder. "Declined?" Naomi let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Declined? That is absolutely impossible. Do you have any idea who you are talking to? That is an exclusive black card with an unlimited spending limit. There is no such thing as declined. Your machine is obviously broken. I assure you, ma'am, our point-of-sale system is working perfectly." The waiter responded firmly, standing his ground. "We just processed several large transactions in the main dining room without any issues. The specific error code on the machine states that the financial institution has completely restricted the account." Derek snatched the black leather folder from the tray, aggressively ripping his heavy card out of the metal clip. His face was rapidly turning a violent shade of crimson. "This is utterly ridiculous," he hissed, glaring up at the waiter. "Do you know how much money I run through this account every single month? The bank probably flagged it for fraud protection because the amount is unusually high for a random Thursday night dinner. They do this all the time to protect their high net worth clients." Derek grabbed his smartphone and fiercely opened his banking application to prove everyone wrong. The entire table watched him in complete silence as his frantic tapping suddenly stopped. He stared at his phone screen, his eyes widening in absolute horror as the blood drained completely from his face. "What is it?" Naomi demanded, her voice losing its musical quality and pitching up into a sharp, anxious tone. She leaned over quickly, trying to rip the smartphone from her husband's shaking hand. "Derek, what does the banking application say? Why are you just staring at it like that?" Derek swallowed audibly, his Adam's apple bobbing. He slowly lowered the phone, looking completely lost. "It says my accounts are frozen," he whispered, as if speaking the words out loud would make them violently real. All of them. The checking, the savings, even the emergency credit lines. The screen just says to contact the financial institution immediately. Naomi snatched the phone from his grip, her eyes rapidly scanning the bright screen. "This cannot be right," she hissed, her manicured acrylic nails tapping furiously against the glass. "There has to be some kind of massive system outage. Banks do not just freeze every single asset without warning. We just closed on a $15 million house today. Oh, for heaven's sake, stop panicking over a simple technical glitch, my father barked, slapping his hand loudly against the table. Richard looked at Derek with absolute disgust, completely unimpressed by his golden child's sudden display of weakness. I told you to let your personal accountant handle the daily transfers, Derek. You probably missed a ridiculous automated payment on one of your leased sports cars and triggered a mandatory security lock. Give me the bill. Richard turned his heavy gaze back to the terrified head waiter who was still standing uncomfortably near the edge of the table. Bring the folder to me, Richard commanded, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance. Let me show my son how a real executive handles minor inconveniences. The waiter stepped forward cautiously and presented the folder to my father. Richard did not even bother looking at the $50,000 total. He confidently reached into his tailored suit and pulled out a heavy platinum card. It was the primary corporate card, tied directly to his logistics company and the family trust fund. Run this, Richard ordered, tossing the platinum card onto the silver tray with a loud clatter. And do not come back into this room until the receipt is printed and ready for my signature. I will be making a very serious phone call to the restaurant owner tomorrow morning about your defective payment machines. The waiter nodded silently, his face pale, and quickly hurried out of the private dining room. The atmosphere at the table had completely shifted. The celebratory birthday energy had evaporated, replaced by a thick and suffocating tension. Derek was staring blankly at his empty hands, completely humiliated. Naomi was fiercely refreshing the banking application on the phone, muttering angry curses under her breath. Susan was trying to maintain her composed high society smile, but her eyes were darting nervously around the room. I simply picked up my glass of sparkling water and took a very slow, refreshing sip. I cannot believe this, Derek finally muttered, running a shaking hand through his perfectly styled hair. The bank is going to hear about this. I am going to sue them for public defamation. Just relax, son, Richard said smoothly, picking up his glass of expensive red wine. The corporate account will cover it. I have millions flowing through that specific trust fund. This is just a minor bump in the road. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy wooden doors slowly creaked open once more. The head waiter walked back in, and this time he looked genuinely afraid. He practically tiptoed toward the head of the table, holding the silver tray out with both hands. The heavy platinum card was sitting right next to the unpaid bill. Richard stopped halfway through a sip of wine. He lowered his crystal glass, his face darkening with a sudden and terrifying rage. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded quietly. "Sir," the waiter stammered, his voice trembling noticeably. "I am so incredibly sorry. I ran it 3 times. I even called our merchant services provider to verify the connection." And Richard roared, leaning forward aggressively. "Your card was also declined, sir," the waiter said quickly, taking a defensive step backward. "The merchant representative told me that your bank issued a hard block. The account has been completely suspended." The entire table descended into absolute chaos. Susan let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. "Richard, what is happening?" she cried out in sheer panic. "That platinum card is tied to our primary trust fund. The country club dues, the car payments, the mortgage on our house. Everything comes out of that specific account." Richard ignored her, pulling out his own smartphone with frantic, clumsy fingers. He violently tapped the screen, logging into his secure financial portal. I watched closely as the confident, untouchable titan of industry physically crumbled right in front of my eyes. A bright red error message illuminated his face. In the dim lighting of the dining room, "Access denied." Richard read aloud, his voice barely a hollow whisper. "Account frozen. Please contact the primary guarantor immediately." Naomi dropped Derek's phone onto the table with a loud clack. She looked at her husband, then at her father-in-law, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "What does that mean?" she demanded sharply. "What do you mean the account is frozen? We need that money for the down payment tomorrow." Derek, say something. But Derek could not say anything. He was completely paralyzed by fear. The brilliant illusion of their massive wealth was rapidly dissolving into thin air, and the panic setting in at the table was absolutely delicious to witness. I gently placed my water glass down on the crisp white tablecloth, ready to deliver the final blow. Richard was not a man who surrendered to reality without a vicious fight. His initial shock quickly morphed into explosive anger. He slammed his fist down onto the crisp white tablecloth so hard that the expensive silverware rattled loudly against the fine porcelain plates. "This is an absolute outrage," he bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "I am not going to sit here and be humiliated. I pay my wealth management firm millions of dollars a year to ensure this exact scenario never happens." He aggressively swiped across his smartphone screen, navigating straight to his personal contacts. Derek watched him with wide, terrified eyes, silently praying that his father could fix this massive disaster. Naomi was biting her bottom lip, her previous arrogance completely shattered. Richard tapped the name of his senior private banker, a man named Harrison, who managed the family trust fund directly from a high-rise office in downtown Los Angeles. "Put it on speakerphone, Richard." Susan pleaded, her voice trembling. "Let us hear what they have to say. This has to be a simple misunderstanding." Richard ignored her, holding the phone up and pressing the speaker button so the entire room could hear him assert his dominance. The phone rang twice before a crisp voice echoed through the dining room. "Good evening," Richard barked. "Then you already know why I am barked. Then you already know why I am furious. I am sitting in the middle of a very important private dinner, and my corporate platinum card was just declined like a piece of worthless plastic. My son's Centurion card was also rejected. Fix this right now, Harrison. I want those accounts unlocked before the waiter comes back, or I am pulling my entire portfolio tomorrow morning." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Harrison finally spoke, his voice was chillingly calm. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Richard. The freeze on your accounts was not an error. It was a direct order executed at the highest administrative level." Richard scoffed, his arrogance shielding him from the truth. "A direct order from whom I am the head of the company. I am the primary beneficiary of the family trust. I give the orders regarding those assets. Override the freeze immediately." "I cannot override it," Richard Harrison replied steadily. "You are the primary beneficiary." "Yes. However, you are not the sole guarantor of the trust. According to the heavily guarded restructuring contract you signed in my office 5 years ago, the trust fund and all associated credit lines are entirely backed by a third-party entity." The room went completely still. Naomi snapped her head toward the phone. "What restructuring contract?" she asked sharply. "Richard, what is he talking about?" Richard looked genuinely confused before his anger masked it again. "I do not know what kind of nonsense you are spouting, Harrison. My company funds that trust. I built that wealth." "Actually, Richard, your company was on the verge of total bankruptcy 5 years ago." Harrison corrected him without sugarcoating the facts. "You were defaulting on massive commercial loans. A silent guarantor stepped in, injected capital into your failing business, and secured the trust fund so you could maintain your standard of living. That guarantor holds absolute legal control over that money." Susan let out a sharp gasp. "Bankruptcy. Richard, you told me the company was having a record-breaking year 5 years ago. You told me we were richer than ever and that our family legacy was completely untouchable." "Shut up, Susan," Richard snapped. He glared at the phone. "This is ridiculous. I demand you unfreeze the money right now. I have a $15 million property closing tomorrow morning. I need those funds cleared immediately." "I am deeply sorry, Richard, but the funds are gone," Harrison stated firmly. "The sole guarantor contacted our legal department exactly 3 hours ago and officially withdrew all financial backing from your accounts. Every single credit line has been permanently severed. The assets remaining in the trust have been seized to pay off the outstanding debts you owe to the guarantor. You currently have a zero balance." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. His entire fake empire was disintegrating right in front of his beloved golden child and his demanding wife. who Richard finally choked out, his voice hoarse and completely stripped of its usual booming authority. Who is the guarantor? Give me their name right now so I can sue them for everything they own. I sat quietly at the end of the table, perfectly calm, waiting for the banker to finally say my name. The silence that instantly descended upon the private dining room was absolute and deafening. It was a thick, suffocating quiet, the kind that occurs right after a massive explosion before the shockwave actually hits. Richard stared blankly at his smartphone resting on the crisp white tablecloth. He blinked once, twice, his brain completely short-circuiting as it tried to process the impossible information. Then he let out a harsh, barking laugh that held absolutely no humor. "That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard," Richard snapped, leaning closer to the phone. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" "Are you trying to be funny, Harrison?" "My daughter is a useless paper pusher who drives a rusted Toyota and lives in a cheap apartment. She does not even have $50,000 to pay a restaurant bill. She is not a chief executive officer of anything." A heavy sigh echoed through the speakerphone. Harrison sounded exhausted, completely worn down by my father's relentless arrogance. "I assure you, Richard, this is not a joke," Harrison replied, his voice firm and completely devoid of pity. "The legal entity that secured your business and funded your trust fund 5 years ago is a subsidiary of Vanguard Apex. And the chief executive officer of Vanguard Apex, the individual who just personally authorized the absolute freeze on all of your financial assets, is your daughter. Natalie is the sole guarantor. She holds the exclusive legal rights to the trust fund and the company assets you leveraged. I strongly suggest you speak directly with her." "Good evening, Richard." A sharp click echoed from the speakerphone, followed by the steady dial tone. Harrison had hung up, leaving my father completely stranded in his new, terrifying reality. Richard slowly lifted his head, turning his gaze away from the phone and locking his eyes on me. His face was a bizarre mask of furious denial and creeping dread. Derek was the first one to break the silence. He slammed his hands down on the table, aggressively pointing a finger at me. "What the hell did you just do?" Derek shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Did you hack into his phone? Did you pay that banker to say that? This is a massive federal crime, Natalie. You are going to federal prison for wire fraud." "I did not hack anything, Derek," I said softly, my voice easily slicing through his hysterical shouting. "And I definitely did not pay Harrison to lie. He works for me. He has worked for me for the past 5 years. Susan gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned entirely white. Her carefully applied makeup suddenly looked like a cheap mask on a frightened ghost. "Natalie, what is going on?" she demanded, her voice trembling violently. "Tell your father you are playing a horrible prank. Tell him right now so we can go home." "This is not a prank, Mom," I replied, remaining perfectly still in my chair. 5 years ago, Dad ran his logistics empire straight into the ground. He was defaulting on massive commercial loans, facing multiple lawsuits, and was exactly 3 days away from filing for total bankruptcy. The bank was getting ready to seize this precious family trust fund. "Do you remember that stressful week, Dad? Do you remember when you magically received an anonymous corporate bailout that saved your precious legacy?" Richard swallowed hard, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray. He remembered perfectly. The sudden influx of cash had been his absolute salvation, and he had eagerly signed the aggressive restructuring contracts without asking a single question about where the money was coming from. "That was my money," I stated clearly, letting the heavy words sink into their panicked minds. "I bought your debt through a shell corporation under Vanguard Apex. I legally secured your trust fund. I paid for this ridiculous high society lifestyle you all love to flaunt. Every designer dress Naomi wears, every luxury car Derek leases, every single drop of expensive wine you just drank tonight. It was all paid for by the daughter you just called a genetic dead weight." Naomi shook her head rapidly, her heavy diamond earrings swinging wildly. "No, She hissed, her eyes wide with total disbelief. No, that is absolutely impossible. You are broke. You wear cheap polyester blouses. You are a nobody. I am the founder of Vanguard Apex, Naomi. I corrected her, locking my eyes directly onto hers. I manage a real estate portfolio worth billions. I wear cheap blouses around you because I realized a long time ago that you are all incredibly shallow. I wanted to see how you would treat me when you thought I had absolutely nothing to offer you. And tonight, you showed me exactly who you are. Richard finally found his voice, though it sounded like it belonged to a very old, deeply broken man. Why, he whispered, staring at me as if I were a stranger. Why did you freeze the accounts tonight? Because I am finally done paying for your arrogance, I answered coldly. You pushed me too far. You bought him a $15 million house with my money, and then you demanded I pay for the dinner. So I withdrew my backing. You are completely cut off. The sheer gravity of my words finally crushed the last remaining ounce of their arrogance. The family was officially shattered. The family was officially shattered. For a long moment, the only sound in the private dining room was the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Then Naomi violently pushed her chair back. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the imported marble floor. She stood up, her emerald green gown shimmering as she glared at me with absolute fury. She refused to accept defeat. Naomi had built her entire identity around marrying into a wealthy legacy, and she was not about to let a woman she considered a bottom feeder tear down her carefully constructed reality. You are lying, Naomi spat, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. You are sitting there lying through your teeth because you are a sad, jealous, and pathetic woman. You heard a rumor about the company having some financial trouble 5 years ago, and you are using it to spin this ridiculous fairy tale. You, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Apex, please. You do not even know how to dress for a high society dinner, let alone run a trillion-dollar real estate empire. I kept my hands folded neatly on my lap, watching her unravel. You can believe whatever you want, Naomi, I said calmly. But the trust fund is frozen and the money is completely gone. It is a glitch, she insisted loudly, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. Or maybe you did somehow manage to lock the credit cards with some cheap identity theft trick you learned on the internet. But do not sit there and pretend you actually hold supreme power over this family. You are talking about a measly trust fund, Natalie. A petty cash account for daily expenses and country club dues. You think freezing that makes you a billionaire mastermind. She turned to Richard, desperately seeking immediate validation. Tell her, Richard. Naomi pleaded, her voice sharp and urgent. Tell this delusional girl exactly who she is dealing with. Remind her about the real assets. Show her the undeniable proof of your wealth so she can crawl back to whatever miserable hole she came from. Richard blinked heavily, snapping out of his temporary paralysis. He looked at Naomi, then down at the silver key resting on the crisp white tablecloth. Suddenly, a desperate spark of hope ignited in his dark eyes. He grabbed the key, holding it up tightly like a protective shield against the crushing reality. Naomi is absolutely right, my father said, his voice regaining a fraction of its usual booming arrogance. You might have found a sneaky way to temporarily block the trust fund, Natalie. Maybe you even convinced Harrison to play along with your pathetic little revenge fantasy because he is a disgruntled employee. But you are completely forgetting one massive, undeniable fact. He slammed the silver key down onto the table with a loud crack. I just bought a $15 million estate in Beverly Hills today. I hold the physical deed. I possess the master key. Vanguard Apex just handed this magnificent property over to me. Do you honestly expect anyone in this room to believe that a massive corporate entity would sell a $15 million mansion to a man who is supposedly completely broke? Naomi let out a triumphant laugh, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Exactly, she sneered, looking down at me as if I were a foolish child. Real estate does not lie, Natalie. You cannot fake a $15 million transaction. If Richard was actually bankrupt, if you were actually the one secretly funding his entire life, Vanguard Apex would never have approved the sale. They would have run a massive financial background check and denied the purchase instantly. You played yourself. Derek seemed to absorb his wife's confident energy. The color slowly returned to his pale face, and he sat up straighter in his chair. He reached out and touched the mahogany box, his arrogant smirk slowly creeping back onto his lips. You really had us going for a second there, Natalie. Derek chuckled nervously. I will admit, paying Harrison to fake that phone call was a bold move for someone as boring as you. But you overplayed your hand. You simply cannot compete with hard physical assets. This house proves that Dad has massive liquid capital hidden away that you know absolutely nothing about. They were incredibly desperate. They were clinging to that heavy silver key like terrified passengers on a sinking ship clinging to a broken piece of wood. They genuinely believed that the Beverly Hills mansion was their ultimate trump card, the undeniable proof of their supreme upper-class status. Naomi leaned forward, resting her hands flat on the white tablecloth. She looked directly into my eyes, her expression hardening into pure venom. You tried to ruin my husband's milestone birthday, she hissed. You tried to humiliate us in front of the restaurant staff because you are deeply bitter that you will never have what we have. But all you did was expose your own severe mental instability. We are moving into a palace tomorrow morning. You are going back to a cramped apartment. Your measly little credit freeze changes absolutely nothing about our actual wealth. I listened to her passionate speech without interrupting once. I let her build that false sense of absolute security, knowing exactly how devastating the actual truth was going to be. They had just proudly presented the Beverly Hills mansion as their ultimate defense. They had completely laid the groundwork for their own spectacular destruction. I slowly reached into my handbag and pulled out my primary mobile phone. I placed it gently onto the table. It is incredibly fascinating that you bring up the Beverly Hills property, Naomi, I said, my voice cutting through their sudden confidence like a sharp blade. Because that house is exactly what I wanted to discuss next. Because that house is exactly what I wanted to discuss next. I tapped the screen of my primary mobile phone swiftly, bringing up a highly encrypted digital file. I slid the phone slowly across the crisp white tablecloth until it rested right next to the silver key my father was guarding so fiercely. Look at the screen, Dad, I instructed calmly. Read the bold text at the very top of the legal document. Richard scoffed loudly, turning his head away in stubborn defiance. I am not looking at whatever fake document you typed up on your lunch break. You are completely bluffing. You do not have the resources to fabricate a real estate contract. I am not bluffing, Richard, I replied, dropping the title of Dad completely. That is the master contract for the Beverly Hills estate, the exact one you signed electronically at 9 o'clock this morning. But since your foolish pride will not let you look at it, I will gladly read the terms out loud for the rest of the table to hear. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. You proudly told Derek and Naomi that you bought the $15 million house outright. You wanted them to firmly believe you had that kind of massive liquid capital just sitting around in a checking account. But that is a complete and absolute lie. You did not buy anything today. You simply leased a highly expensive illusion. Naomi frowned deeply, her eyes darting nervously from the silver key back to my phone. What do you mean he did not buy it? She demanded. He has the deed right there in the box. He has a piece of paper that temporarily says he is allowed to walk through the front door. Naomi? I corrected her smoothly. He put down a non-refundable cash deposit of exactly $500,000. That was the absolute maximum amount of cash he could scrape together by completely draining the last remaining reserves of his failing logistics company. To cover the remaining $14.5 million, he took out a commercial bridge loan. Derek stared at our father, his jaw dropping open in pure shock. A bridge loan? Dad, what is she talking about right now? Bridge loans are for desperate real estate developers trying to flip cheap properties. You stood there and told us you paid in full with cash. Richard remained completely silent. His face was frozen in a rigid mask of absolute terror. He was staring at my phone as if it were an explosive device ticking rapidly down to zero. He took a massive commercial bridge loan. I continued, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet dining room. And because his actual credit history is a complete disaster, hidden behind a frozen trust fund, he had no choice but to accept a predatory interest rate of 18%. The monthly payments are absolutely astronomical. But Richard did not care about the monthly payments, did he? Because he foolishly planned to use the trust fund money to cover the massive debt, completely unaware that the trust fund belonged entirely to me. Susan gasped loudly, gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table. Richard, tell me right now that she is making this up. Tell me you did not mortgage our entire livelihood for a high-risk bridge loan. If the trust fund is frozen, how are we supposed to pay for the house tomorrow? You are not going to pay for the house, Mom. I answered for him, my tone completely merciless. Because the private entity that issued that $14.5 million bridge loan was a lending subsidiary owned entirely by Vanguard Apex. I am the direct lender. I personally hold the mortgage on your beautiful new Beverly Hills mansion. Naomi let out a sharp, breathless sound, quickly stepping back from the table as if the silver key had suddenly caught fire. She looked at Richard with absolute disgust. You took out a $14 million loan with an 18% interest rate. Are you completely insane? How could you put my husband in that kind of extreme financial danger just to show off? It was perfectly managed, Richard suddenly shouted, his voice cracking loudly with rising desperation. It was a highly calculated corporate maneuver. I was going to secure a lower interest mortgage next month and pay off the bridge loan entirely. It is standard business practice for high net worth individuals. It is complete financial suicide, I corrected him sharply. And you just pulled the trigger. According to the strict legal terms of the contract you signed with Vanguard Apex, the very first payment is due at the time of closing, which is tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Since I just completely froze your trust fund and severed your credit lines, that payment will immediately bounce. Derek looked like he was going to be physically sick. He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning pure white under the chandelier light. What happens when the payment bounces? He asked, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. When the payment bounces, the loan goes into immediate default. I explained calmly, maintaining unbroken eye contact with my trembling brother. The contract includes a strict acceleration clause. Vanguard Apex will immediately seize the property. You will never even step foot inside that massive house. Furthermore, because Richard aggressively used his logistics company as collateral to secure the bridge loan, Vanguard Apex now has the absolute legal right to liquidate all of his corporate assets to recover the massive debt. I sat back in my chair, quietly watching the absolute devastation wash over their pale faces. In a matter of minutes, the glorious $15 million dream house had transformed into the exact weapon I used to destroy them. The golden child was not getting a mansion tonight. He was getting a front-row seat to his father's complete financial ruin. The heavy silence that followed my declaration was quickly shattered by a harsh and guttural sound. It was Richard. My father threw his head back and let out a booming laugh that sounded forced and completely unhinged. He reached for his crystal wine glass, his hand shaking so violently that a few drops of the expensive vintage spilled onto the pristine white tablecloth. He took a large gulp, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and glared at me with renewed arrogance. You really are putting on a spectacular performance tonight, Natalie, he sneered, slamming the glass down. I have to give you credit. You memorized some impressive corporate buzzwords. Bridge loan, acceleration clause, liquidation. You sound exactly like one of those junior analysts fresh out of business school trying to sound important. But you are missing one massive component in your little fairy tale of revenge. You do not understand how real power works in the corporate world. Richard stood up from his chair, straightening his tailored suit jacket. He puffed out his chest, completely desperate to regain control of the room. You see, he lectured, pacing slowly behind his chair. Vanguard Apex is not some local credit union that panics over a missed deadline. They manage trillions of dollars in assets. They do not instantly foreclose on a highly valuable client over a technicality. I am not just a random customer on a spreadsheet. I am a VIP client. I have a deeply established relationship with the senior executives at that firm. Susan let out a massive, trembling breath, pressing her hand over her heart. Oh, thank God, she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut in sheer relief. Richard, you terrified me. I actually thought we were going to lose everything for a second. We are not losing anything, Susan. Richard snapped defensively. I play golf with their regional vice presidents at the country club every single month. We drink single malt scotch together. They know my logistics company is a pillar of the community. They know my family legacy. If there is a temporary freeze on my trust fund, I will simply make a phone call tomorrow morning, explain the situation to my contacts, and they will gladly extend the payment deadline. They would never dare touch my assets. They respect me too much to risk losing my business. Derek eagerly latched onto his father's confident delusion. The paralyzing fear instantly melted from his face, replaced by his usual mocking smirk. Exactly, Derek chimed in, pointing an accusing finger at me. Do you really think a trillion-dollar empire cares about your petty little family drama, Natalie? You are completely psychotic. You probably hacked into Dad's email to steal the details of the bridge loan just so you could come here and try to scare us. But you failed. Dad is a highly respected titan. He has leverage. You have absolutely nothing. Naomi, however, did not look entirely convinced. She sat perfectly still, her sharp eyes darting between Richard's flushed face and my completely relaxed posture. Richard, she said slowly, her voice tight with underlying anxiety. Are you absolutely sure about this? Bridge loans are incredibly dangerous. If the contract has a strict acceleration clause like she says, even a VIP status might not protect you from a default. Did you actually read the fine print before you leveraged the company? Do not. You dare question my business acumen? Naomi. Richard barked, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. I have been navigating complex financial markets since before you were born. I know exactly what I am doing. I am a highly valued partner to Vanguard Apex. They need my portfolio just as much as I need their capital. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement. I listened to his desperate speech, feeling a deep wave of second-hand embarrassment. His arrogance had completely blinded him to his actual standing in the world. He was a small fish, swimming in a massive ocean, entirely unaware that he was already trapped in the net. You are incredibly delusional, Dad, I said calmly, resting my forearms on the table. You think playing golf with a few regional managers makes you a VIP. Those men you drink scotch with are nothing but mid-level employees. They have strict sales quotas to meet, and they saw you as an easy mark. They stroked your massive ego, praised your failing legacy, and convinced you to sign a predatory contract because they knew it would earn them a massive commission. I leaned forward, locking my eyes with his. They do not respect you, Richard. They categorized your file under high-risk liabilities. And when it comes to high-risk liabilities, Vanguard Apex does not grant extensions. They execute immediate liquidations. The regional vice presidents you are so proud of knowing report directly to the chief operating officer. And the chief operating officer reports directly to me. I do not care about your golf handicap, and I certainly do not care about your legacy. I signed the official foreclosure order on your assets 20 minutes before I walked into this restaurant. Your VIP status is just another one of your pathetic illusions. Derek let out a loud and highly exaggerated groan, throwing his hands up in the air as if he were dealing with a deeply disturbed patient in a psychiatric ward. He looked at our parents with a patronizing smile, completely dismissing the heavy tension I had just dropped onto the table. This has gone far enough, Derek announced, shaking his head. I genuinely think she is having a psychotic break. She has been sitting in that cramped little apartment for so long, completely isolated from real success, that she has actually started to believe her own ridiculous lies. Naomi leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms tightly and shooting me a look of pure disgust. It is honestly pathetic, Naomi chimed in her voice, dripping with venom. You are wearing a polyester blouse that probably cost $20 on clearance, and you expect us to believe you run a $1 trillion real estate empire. The chief executive officer of Vanguard Apex would be wearing custom designer clothes and dripping in flawless diamonds. You do not even have a proper manicure, Natalie. You look like you just finished scrubbing a public restroom at a local bus station. I glanced down at my perfectly clean, unpolished nails and then back up at my sister-in-law. Real billionaires do not need to wear their net worth on their sleeves, Naomi. I replied smoothly. We leave the flashy designer logos for people who are desperately trying to prove they belong in a world they cannot actually afford. Naomi's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with sudden anger, but before she could snap back, Derek aggressively slammed his hand on the table to command the room. Stop engaging with her, Naomi. Derek commanded, his arrogance reaching absolute peak levels. Do not validate her insanity. Dad, Mom, just take a deep breath and relax. I am going to put an end to this embarrassing little fantasy right now. Derek reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. He unlocked the screen with a highly confident smirk, holding the device up so everyone at the table could see what he was doing. When Dad and I were reviewing the final bridge loan documents this morning, the regional vice president gave us the direct emergency contact number for the corporate executive office. He told us that if we needed any immediate assistance with the massive wire transfer tomorrow, we could bypass the regular customer service lines and speak directly to the chief operating officer himself. Susan let out a sigh of immense relief, pressing her hand against her chest. Oh, Derek, thank goodness you are so organized, she breathed, looking at her son with pure adoration. Call them right now. Please put an end to this absolute nightmare so we can go back to celebrating your beautiful new house. Derek nodded quickly, typing a sequence of numbers into his phone. He looked directly at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. I'm going to put this on speakerphone, Natalie. I am going to call Oliver Montgomery, the Chief Operating Officer of Vanguard Apex. And when he answers, I am going to personally report you for corporate identity theft. I am going to tell him that a low-level administrative assistant is sitting in a restaurant in California, actively impersonating the founder of his company and attempting to unlawfully cancel a $14 million real estate transaction. Richard let out a harsh, vindictive laugh, finally sitting back down in his chair. That is a brilliant idea, son. Let her hear it straight from the executive office. Identity theft and financial fraud on this massive scale is a major federal crime. She is going to be facing decades in a federal penitentiary by the time this night is over. You really thought you could come to my 35th birthday dinner, sit at my table and play? God, Derek asked, leaning closer to me. You thought you could ruin the greatest night of my life just because you are a miserable failure. I am going to make sure Vanguard Apex prosecutes you to the absolute fullest extent of the law. You are making a massive mistake, Derek, I said quietly, keeping my face perfectly neutral. I strongly suggest you put the phone away and walk out of this restaurant while you still have a shred of dignity left. Derek scoffed loudly, completely ignoring my warning. My brother was so deeply blinded by his own inflated ego that he could not see the massive concrete wall he was rapidly driving into. Nice try, but your cheap reverse psychology is not going to work on me, he sneered. You are terrified because you know you are about to be completely exposed. Get ready to face the music, little sister. With a dramatic flourish, Derek pressed the bright green call button and immediately tapped the speaker icon. He placed the smartphone directly in the center of the crisp white tablecloth right next to the silver key and the black leather dinner bill. The entire dining room fell completely silent. The only sound was the clear, rhythmic ringing tone echoing from the speaker of Derek's phone. 1 ring, 2 rings. The anticipation at the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. Susan and Richard leaned forward eagerly, waiting to hear the authoritative voice of a corporate executive completely destroy my credibility. Naomi smiled viciously, already silently celebrating my impending downfall. 3 rings. And then something entirely unexpected happened. As the 4th ring began to echo from Derek's phone, a highly distinct, customized ringtone started playing simultaneously. But the sound was not coming from the phone sitting in the middle of the table. The loud, crisp ringing was coming directly from the inside of my handbag resting quietly near my feet. The loud, crisp ringing was coming directly from the inside of my handbag resting quietly near my feet. Every single time Derek's phone emitted an outgoing tone, the device hidden inside my bag matched it flawlessly. It was a perfect, undeniable electronic echo that instantly shattered the arrogant silence of the private dining room. Derek frowned deeply, leaning over the crisp white tablecloth to glare down at my purse. "Turn that garbage off right now, Natalie," he snapped, his voice tight with sudden irritation. "I am trying to make a highly important phone call to a corporate executive. We absolutely do not need your cheap prepaid phone interrupting the connection and making us look unprofessional." Susan waved her hand frantically in the air, her face twisting in pure annoyance. "Honestly, the blatant disrespect you show is staggering," my mother complained. "Mute that obnoxious ringing right this instant. It is incredibly rude to disrupt your brother when he is conducting serious business." I did not mute it. I simply reached down and slowly unzipped the top compartment of my handbag. I pulled out a sleek, solid black mobile device. It was not my primary phone. It was a highly secure, heavily encrypted executive line designed specifically to look completely unassuming to the untrained eye. The bright screen was flashing intensely with an incoming call alert. Derek's phone on the table rang for the 5th time. My secure device chimed in perfect unison. I slowly brought the phone up and placed it gently onto the table, directly next to Derek's expensive smartphone. The two devices sat side by side, engaging in a flawless, synchronized duet. One ring going out, one ring coming in. Richard stared at my phone, his thick gray eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a low, cautious rumble. "Who is calling you at this hour?" "Nobody is calling me Dad," I replied evenly, keeping my eyes locked on Derek. "Derek is calling me." Naomi let out a sharp, breathless scoff, shaking her head vigorously. "You are completely out of your mind," she sneered, though her voice lacked its previous confident melody. "Derek is calling the Chief Operating Officer of Vanguard Apex in New York. Why in the world would your pathetic little phone be ringing?" "Look at the screen, Naomi," I instructed calmly. She leaned forward, her emerald silk gown rustling against the wooden chair. Derek followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing as he read the bright digital text flashing across my screen. The caller identification system on my executive line was highly advanced. It did not just show a random phone number, it displayed the exact registered name of the caller. Derek swallowed hard. The color began to rapidly drain from his face once again. The screen clearly displayed his full legal name followed by his personal cell phone number. "This is a cheap trick," Derek whispered, his voice shaking slightly. He looked up at me, his arrogant facade finally beginning to crack under the immense weight of the impossible coincidence. "You downloaded some kind of malicious software to intercept my outgoing calls. You are hacking my network just to mess with my head." "I do not need to hack your network, Derek," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. "You dialed the direct emergency contact number for the corporate executive office of Vanguard Apex. You bypassed the regular customer service lines, just like the regional vice president told you to do. That highly secure number does not route to a random call center. It routes directly to the chief executive officer. It routes directly to me." Susan shook her head completely, rejecting the reality unfolding right in front of her. "No, that is completely impossible. You are just playing a stupid game. Hang up, Derek. Hang up and dial the number again. She probably just memorized the digits and called herself from a different phone to trick us." Derek hesitated, his finger hovering nervously over the red end call button on his screen. He was terrified to press it, and he was even more terrified to let the call continue. "Do not hang up, Derek," I challenged him softly. "If you genuinely believe I am running a cheap parlor trick, let the phone keep ringing. See exactly who answers." The phones rang for the 7th time. The piercing sound echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Richard clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of the table. "Answer it then." My father growled, his voice thick with stubborn denial. "If you are so confident in this ridiculous charade, answer the phone. Let us hear Oliver Montgomery tell you to stop playing these psychotic games." "Gladly," I replied. I reached out and pressed the bright green accept button on my secure device. The very second my finger tapped the screen, the ringing stopped completely on both phones. A soft electronic beep signaled that the call had successfully connected. I did not lift the device to my ear. I tapped the speakerphone icon, allowing the audio to broadcast clearly across the dining table. Then I looked directly at my brother, my face completely devoid of any emotion, waiting for him to speak. Derek stared at the glowing screen of my phone, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was entirely trapped in his own snare, and the entire room was waiting for him to make the next move. He cleared his throat loudly, trying desperately to summon his usual arrogant bravado. "This is Derek," he announced, leaning closer to the speaker. His voice was slightly shaky, betraying the sheer panic bubbling just beneath the surface. "I am calling to speak directly with Oliver Montgomery. I need to report a massive security breach. There is a deranged woman sitting at my dinner table right now, claiming to be the founder of Vanguard Apex, and she is attempting to interfere with my father's $14 million real estate transaction." A calm, deeply professional voice resonated from the speaker of my phone. The audio quality was crystal clear, filling the silent dining room with absolute authority. "Good evening, Derek," the voice replied smoothly. "This is Oliver Montgomery, the Chief Operating Officer of Vanguard Apex. However, you are highly mistaken about the security breach. There is no deranged woman at your table. You are currently sitting across from the sole founder, majority shareholder, and chief executive officer of this entire trillion-dollar enterprise. You are sitting across from my boss, Natalie. Good evening, ma'am. I assume the birthday dinner is not going very well." "Good evening, Oliver," I replied calmly. "You assume correctly. They are having a very difficult time processing the reality of their financial situation. Could you please clarify the current status of Richard's corporate accounts and the Oak Pass Road property for them?" Derek stumbled backward, his legs hitting his chair with a loud thud. He collapsed into the seat, his eyes wide and completely vacant. Richard gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table, his knuckles turning pure white. "Of course, ma'am," Oliver stated, his tone shifting into strict corporate efficiency. "Richard, if you are listening, please be advised that as of 8:15 this evening, the legal department of Vanguard Apex has officially executed the acceleration clause on your commercial bridge loan. Because your primary trust fund was frozen by our chief executive officer, you are currently in breach of the initial funding requirements. That is illegal." Richard suddenly roared, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "You cannot seize a company over a missed deadline that has not even happened yet. The closing is tomorrow morning. I will hire a team of lawyers and drag your entire firm through federal court. I will completely destroy Vanguard Apex. You do not have the capital to hire a paralegal, let alone a team of corporate attorneys," Oliver corrected him coldly. "You signed a high-risk expedited funding agreement. The fine print clearly stipulates that any loss of primary financial backing constitutes an immediate default. Your logistics company was listed as the primary collateral. Therefore, Vanguard Apex has legally assumed total control of your business assets. Your corporate headquarters will be locked down by our private security teams at midnight. Your employees will be notified of the hostile takeover tomorrow morning." Susan let out a piercing wail, covering her face with her hands. "Richard, tell him to stop," she sobbed hysterically. "Tell him we will give the house back. We do not need the Beverly Hills mansion. Just give the house back and let us keep the company. I am afraid returning the house is not an option. Susan Oliver continued, showing absolutely no mercy to my weeping mother. The $15 million transaction has been formally voided. The electronic deed your husband possesses is now entirely worthless. Furthermore, the $500,000 cash deposit Richard provided this morning is strictly non-refundable under the terms of the default. That money has been absorbed to cover our administrative penalty fees. Naomi gasped loudly, her hands flying up to grip her hair. The deposit, she shrieked, looking at Richard with absolute murderous intent. You gave them a $500,000 deposit in cash. That was supposed to be our emergency safety net. You completely drained the corporate accounts for a house we do not even own. Richard did not answer her. He could not speak. The untouchable titan of industry was physically trembling, his silver hair suddenly looking disheveled, his expensive Rolex feeling like a heavy shackle around his wrist. He was staring at the speakerphone as if it were a judge handing down a fatal sentence. Are there any further questions regarding the foreclosures? Ma'am, Oliver asked, his voice returning to a respectful, measured tone as he addressed me. The liquidation team is standing by to process the final asset transfers. No, Oliver, that will be all, I said softly. You have made the situation perfectly clear. Please proceed with the immediate liquidation of Richard's logistics company. Have a good night. I reached out and pressed the red button on my screen, severing the connection. The loud electronic click echoed through the private dining room, bringing an absolute end to my father's 40-year legacy. The grand illusion of their massive wealth had been entirely incinerated in less than 5 minutes. They had absolutely nothing left. The realization settled over the table like a suffocating lead blanket. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The heavy silver key to the Beverly Hills mansion, which had been passed around like a sacred trophy just minutes ago, now lay completely abandoned next to the $50,000 dinner bill that none of them could afford to pay. Richard stared blankly at the crisp white tablecloth, his breathing shallow and rapid. The proud, booming patriarch, who had spent my entire life belittling my existence, was paralyzed by his own greed. He had gambled his logistics company on a desperate flex of ego, and he had lost spectacularly. Derek looked like a deflated balloon. The bespoke Italian suit he wore suddenly seemed far too large for his slumping shoulders. He ran a shaking hand over his face, unable to meet the furious glare of his wife. "What are we going to do?" Susan whispered, her voice breaking the heavy silence. She looked around the room with wide, terrified eyes, as if expecting private security teams to barge through the restaurant doors right at that exact moment. "Richard, you have to fix this. Call your lawyers. Call anyone." "He cannot call anyone, Mom," I said calmly, returning my secure phone to my handbag. "Because anyone he calls will require a massive retainer fee, and as of tonight, his net worth is entirely negative. Vanguard, Apex owns the logistics company, the commercial real estate it sits on, and every single company vehicle." Naomi abruptly pushed her chair back and stood up. The emerald silk gown she wore rustled sharply against the heavy silence of the room. "You dragged me into this financial sinkhole," she hissed. "You told me your father was a genius and we were securing generational wealth. But you are both nothing but cheap con artists playing with monopoly money." "Naomi, please calm down," Derek begged, holding his hands up defensively. "We will figure this out. I have my corporate contacts. I can leverage my industry experience to get an executive position somewhere else. We can still afford a good life." "A good life?" Naomi laughed harshly, a bitter and hollow sound. "Your industry experience consists of playing golf and charging expensive lunches to a corporate credit card. You do not even know how to run a basic spreadsheet. You are 35 years old, and you just got financially obliterated by the sister you spent the entire night mocking. I am not going down with this sinking ship." Susan started crying louder, her perfectly contoured makeup ruined by desperate tears. "Natalie, please," she begged. "You made your point. We are sorry for the things we said. Just undo the foreclosure. You cannot leave your own flesh and blood completely destitute. You taught me how to handle family, Mom. I replied softly. You taught me that family is just a hierarchy of power, where the person with the least money deserves the maximum disrespect. I am simply applying the exact rules you created. Before Susan could launch into another desperate plea, a sharp and distinct electronic chime cut through the tense atmosphere of the private dining room. It was a standard news notification sound, but it did not just come from one device. A second chime echoed from Naomi's diamond-encrusted smartphone. Then a third chime rang out from Derek's device sitting uselessly on the table. A fourth chime came from Richard's tailored pocket. Within seconds, the entire private room was filled with a chorus of digital alerts, but it did not stop there. The sound rapidly multiplied, bleeding through the heavy wooden doors from the main dining area of the French Laundry. It sounded like a coordinated digital symphony. Ping, ping, ping. Every single smartphone, smartwatch, and digital tablet in the entire restaurant was receiving the exact same breaking news alert at the exact same millisecond. The sheer volume of the synchronized notifications created a highly surreal and disorienting atmosphere. The head waiter, who had been hovering nervously near the entrance, waiting for someone to finally pay the dinner bill, reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out his phone. I watched through this crack in the doors as diners at the incredibly expensive tables outside stopped mid-sentence, setting down their crystal wine glasses to look at their glowing screens. "What is happening?" Derek muttered, his voice trembling as he reached for his phone on the table. "Why is every device in the building going off at once?" I sat perfectly still, resting my hands neatly on my lap. I knew exactly what was happening. I had meticulously scheduled the massive press release to go live at 9 o'clock sharp. The timing was absolutely flawless. The trap had firmly snapped shut, and the final lock was about to click into place. The trap had firmly snapped shut, and the final lock was about to click into place. Derek was the first one to snatch his smartphone off the crisp white tablecloth. His hands were trembling so violently that he nearly dropped the expensive device onto his untouched dessert plate. He swiped his thumb across the screen to unlock it, his eyes rapidly scanning the sudden influx of push notifications. I watched his face closely. I watched the exact second his brain processed the glowing digital letters. His jaw went completely slack, and a low, suffocating gasp escaped his throat. "What is it?" Naomi demanded, her voice sharp and highly anxious. She frantically dug into her designer emerald clutch and pulled out her own diamond-encrusted phone. Richard and Susan immediately followed suit, their previous despair momentarily overridden by the sheer panic of the synchronized alarms ringing around them. "It is an alert from Forbes magazine," Derek whispered, his voice sounding hollow and far away. He did not look up from the screen. He was completely captivated, trapped by the glowing pixels of his absolute worst nightmare. A breaking news notification. The annual billionaire list just dropped online. Richard let out a frustrated and exhausted sigh, rubbing his temples aggressively. "Who cares about a magazine list right now, Derek? We are currently losing everything we own. Turn off your useless notifications and help me figure out how to stop this hostile corporate takeover." But Derek did not turn off his notifications. He slowly looked up, his eyes completely bloodshot, staring at me as if I had just grown a second head. "You need to look at this, Dad," Derek said, his voice completely devoid of his usual arrogance. "You need to look at the front page right now." Naomi had already opened the digital magazine application. The bright light from her phone illuminated her face, highlighting the sheer and absolute terror washing over her perfectly contoured features. She let out a sharp, choked sound, aggressively shoving her phone directly into Richard's face across the table. "Read it, Richard," Naomi commanded, her voice cracking under the intense emotional strain. "Read the headline out loud, so I know I am not having a psychotic break." Richard blinked heavily, adjusting his posture as he focused his aging eyes on the bright screen of his daughter-in-law's phone. The entire dining room felt like it was holding its collective breath. The background chatter from the main restaurant had died down completely as other wealthy patrons absorbed the exact same breaking news on their own devices. Richard swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, but his voice failed him on the first attempt. He cleared his throat and tried again, reading the bold black text dominating the digital cover of the world's most prestigious financial publication. The secret billionaire behind Vanguard Apex and its trillion-dollar real estate empire finally steps into the light. Richard stopped reading. His hands began to shake just as violently as Derek's hands. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist clinked softly against the wooden edge of the table. "Keep reading, Dad," I instructed calmly, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. "Read the subheadline. Do not skip any of the important details." Susan was openly weeping now, clutching her own phone, but completely terrified to look at the screen. "What does it say, Richard?" she cried out softly. "What does the article say?" Richard took a deep, ragged breath. He looked like a man standing in front of a firing squad. He lowered his eyes back to the screen and continued reading the smaller text beneath the massive headline. "For the past 5 years, the global financial markets have heavily speculated about the invisible force driving Vanguard Apex to absolute market dominance," Richard read aloud, every single word sounding like a sharp nail being driven into his own coffin. Today, that phantom architect is finally revealed. Holding a verified personal net worth exceeding $40 billion in liquid assets and commercial real estate, she is officially the youngest self-made female billionaire in American history. Her ruthless investment strategies and complete corporate anonymity have redefined the modern wealth landscape. Richard slowly lowered the phone. He placed it back onto the table directly next to the useless silver key and the rejected platinum credit card. The undeniable reality of the situation had finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his massive ego. He was not a highly respected titan of industry. He was a complete failure who had spent his entire life actively belittling a woman who possessed more wealth and power than he could ever comprehend in a dozen lifetimes. Naomi dropped her head into her hands, her manicured fingers gripping her hair tightly. $40 billion, she whispered to herself over and over again. $40 billion. The head waiter, who was still standing completely frozen near the heavy wooden doors, slowly lowered his own smartphone. He looked at the screen, then looked directly at me. His eyes widened in sheer panic, and he immediately took 2 respectful steps backward, bowing his head slightly in extreme reverence. He had just realized that the woman they were aggressively trying to force to pay a $50,000 dinner bill could easily buy the entire French Laundry restaurant franchise with the spare change in her pocket. The head waiter slowly backed out of the room, gently pulling the heavy wooden doors completely shut behind him. He wanted absolutely no part in the nuclear fallout that was about to happen at our table. Inside the private dining room, the suffocating silence returned, broken only by the soft and rhythmic swiping of fingers against digital glass. Derek was the first to scroll past the massive headline. I watched his eyes track downward as the high-resolution cover image finally loaded on his glowing screen. It was a spectacular photograph professionally taken just 2 weeks ago in my New York penthouse office. In the picture, I was not wearing a clearance rack polyester blouse or sitting with slumped shoulders. I was dressed in a sharp and custom-tailored midnight blue Tom Ford executive suit. I was standing in front of a massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Manhattan skyline, my arms confidently crossed, wearing an expression of absolute and untouchable authority. The caption beneath the photo read, "Natalie, the undisputed queen of commercial real estate." Naomi stared at the exact same image on her own diamond-encrusted phone. Her jaw trembled slightly as she absorbed the visual proof of my actual life. The emerald green designer gown she was wearing suddenly seemed incredibly cheap compared to the sheer unadulterated power radiating from the digital portrait in her hands. She looked from her screen directly to me, her eyes darting frantically back and forth as if trying to mathematically reconcile the 2 completely different women. The woman she had ruthlessly mocked for having scuffed shoes and a poverty mindset was staring back at her from the front page of the most prestigious financial publication on the entire planet. But it was my mother who truly captured the absolute gravity of the devastating moment. Susan finally forced herself to look down at the device resting in her lap. As her eyes landed on the full-page photo of her only daughter, all the blood instantly drained from her face. Her complexion turned stark white, perfectly matching the crisp linen tablecloth beneath her violently trembling hands. The layers of expensive cosmetic foundation and her perfectly applied contouring could not hide the sheer terror and profound agonizing regret, violently washing over her aging features. The entire room went dead silent. It was a heavy and highly oppressive quiet. Nobody dared to breathe. Nobody dared to move a single muscle. The undeniable visual proof had completely stripped away their ability to argue, to deny, or to gaslight me ever again. I was no longer the genetic dead weight they had spent 3 decades kicking around. I was the absolute apex predator in a room full of arrogant, oblivious herbivores. For 33 years, I had quietly absorbed their vicious insults. I had allowed them to treat me like a disposable burden while I secretly built a corporate empire that entirely dwarfed their wildest financial imaginations. I had anonymously paid for Derek's luxury sports cars, Naomi's massive diamond rings, and my parents' exclusive country club memberships. I had generously funded their grand illusion of high society superiority out of a misplaced sense of familial duty. I had given them every single tool they needed to succeed, and they had chosen to use those tools to brutally hammer me down. Now the heavy financial hammer was firmly resting right here in my own hand. Richard dropped his smartphone onto the table as if the metal casing had suddenly turned red hot. The device clattered loudly against the fine porcelain dessert plates, but he did not even flinch at the sharp noise. His chest was heaving with rapid and shallow breaths. He stared at the glowing picture of me on his screen, then slowly raised his head to look at the real me, sitting quietly at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. The intense, fiery arrogance that had defined his entire personality for 65 years was completely extinguished. He looked hollow, entirely defeated by his own spectacular hubris. Derek was equally paralyzed in his chair. The golden child, the supposed genius vice president of the family logistics empire, could not even form a coherent sentence. He just sat there and kept blinking rapidly, completely unable to process the fact that his useless sister was actually a self-made billionaire who now legally owned every single asset his father had ever built. The absolute silence stretched on thick and entirely suffocating. They were waiting for me to speak. They were desperately waiting for me to offer them some kind of emotional lifeline, a sliver of familial forgiveness that would somehow magically reverse the complete destruction of their lives. I took my time enjoying the stillness before preparing to deliver the final legal blow. I took my time enjoying the stillness before preparing to deliver the final legal blow. But before I could even reach for my handbag to summon my corporate attorneys, the psychological pivot finally happened. It was a spectacular, almost theatrical display of pure survival instinct. The heavy, oppressive silence was suddenly broken by the sound of a wooden chair scraping against the imported marble floor. My mother stood up. The tears of absolute terror that had been streaming down her face just moments ago magically vanished, replaced by a wide, trembling, and utterly fake smile. She walked slowly around the edge of the long mahogany table, her arms outstretched, as if she were approaching a religious deity. "Oh, Natalie." Susan breathed, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet affection that instantly made my skin crawl. "My brilliant, wonderful girl, I cannot believe it. I just cannot believe it." She stopped a few feet away from me, clasping her manicured hands tightly against her chest. I looked up at her, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "What exactly cannot you believe, Mom?" I asked softly. "That I am a billionaire, or that I finally stopped letting you use me as a human doormat?" Susan let out a breathless musical laugh, waving her hand dismissively, just like she had done when she demanded I pay the $50,000 dinner bill. "Do not be silly, darling," she cooed, her eyes darting nervously back to the glowing screen of her phone. "We always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. We knew you had this incredible hidden potential inside you from the very beginning. I raised a single eyebrow. You always knew, I repeated, letting the profound absurdity of her statement hang heavily in the air. Half an hour ago, you told me I was a total embarrassment to the family name. You said my path led straight to the bottom of the food chain. Susan stepped closer, reaching out to gently touch my shoulder. I leaned back slightly, explicitly denying her physical contact. She awkwardly dropped her hand, but her desperate smile remained glued to her face. "You do not understand, Natalie," she pleaded, her voice taking on a maternal protective tone that she had never once used with me during my entire childhood. "That was just our way of motivating you. It was tough love. Your father and I, we saw how comfortable you were getting in that little apartment, and we knew we had to push you. We had to be harsh, so you would fight back and build this magnificent empire. We are the direct reason you are so successful today." The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. She was actually trying to take full credit for the $40 billion real estate empire I had built entirely on my own, claiming that 3 decades of emotional abuse was simply a strategic parenting technique. "You are the favorite daughter, Natalie." Susan continued, her voice trembling with intense desperation. "You always have been our true pride and joy. Derek is just, well, he is a boy. He needed coddling and constant financial support. But you were our strong, independent warrior. And now look at you. You have conquered the entire world." Richard suddenly cleared his throat, snapping out of his own paralyzed stupor. He quickly adjusted his expensive Italian suit jacket and stood up, trying to mimic my mother's sudden affectionate pivot. He plastered a highly unnatural, proud grin across his aging face. "Your mother is absolutely right, kid," Richard announced, his booming voice attempting to project deep warmth instead of his usual arrogant condescension. "I have to admit, you completely outsmarted the old man tonight. You set a brilliant trap and I walked right into it. That is the exact killer instinct I have been talking about all evening. You did not just survive the brutal American market, Natalie. You dominated it." He walked around the table, standing right next to Susan, looking down at me with feigned paternal pride. "You are the true heir to the family legacy," Richard declared proudly. "Derek is a good kid, but he does not have your ruthless executive vision. Now let us put all these silly little misunderstandings behind us. You made your point perfectly. You are the boss. I will happily step down and let you merge my logistics company into Vanguard Apex. We can run the entire empire together as a family. Just call Oliver back and lift the freeze on the trust fund, and we can go celebrate your massive success at the new Beverly Hills estate." Their rapid transformation was a masterclass in toxic manipulation. In their wealthy suburban social circles, this was how people survived. They faked smiles, forged convenient alliances, and completely ignored their own abhorrent behavior when there was massive money on the line. Even Naomi decided to join the pathetic survival chorus. She leaned across the table, offering me a highly practiced sisterly smile. "You know, Natalie," Naomi purred, her tone shifting from vicious to incredibly supportive, "I always told Derek that you had a secret brilliance about you. We strong women need to stick together in this male-dominated corporate world. I would be absolutely honored to help you organize charity galas for Vanguard Apex." They were completely shameless. They were perfectly willing to erase decades of cruelty and instantly rewrite history if it meant keeping their greedy hands on my massive wealth. I let them finish their desperate, groveling speeches. I let them build up a tiny, fragile ounce of hope that their disgusting gaslighting had actually worked on me. Then I reached into my handbag and pulled out a small electronic remote control. "I am not lifting the freeze, Dad," I said coldly, "and I am definitely not your favorite daughter, Mom." I pressed the single button on the remote, signaling the final phase of my legal plan. I pressed the single button on the remote, signaling the final phase of my legal plan. 3 individuals stepped into the room. 3 individuals stepped into the room, instantly changing the entire atmospheric pressure of the space. Leading the group was Gregory, the senior corporate counsel for Vanguard Apex. He was a tall, incredibly imposing man, wearing a charcoal gray bespoke suit carrying a thick, black leather briefcase. Flanking him were two equally sharp associate attorneys, their faces completely devoid of any emotion. They looked like an execution squad dressed in designer wool, stepping into the extravagant birthday party to deliver a fatal blow. Susan gasped loudly, instinctively stepping backward and aggressively grabbing Richard's arm for support. Derek sank deeper into his wooden chair, his arrogant posture completely collapsing. Naomi stared at the legal team, her eyes widening, as she immediately recognized the sheer, unapologetic corporate power they represented. She had spent her entire adult life trying to climb the social ladder, and she knew exactly what real wealth and legal machinery looked like when it entered a room. "You want to run the empire together, Dad?" I asked, my voice slicing effortlessly through the sudden and suffocating tension. "You want to merge your completely bankrupt logistics company with my trillion-dollar real estate portfolio? That is quite possibly the most pathetic business proposal I have ever heard in my entire life. And Mom, you can drop the loving mother act right now. It looks completely unnatural on you." I stood up from my chair, slowly smoothing the front of my clothing. "You did not use tough love to motivate me, Susan. You used cruelty to make yourself feel superior. You spent my entire life trying to break my spirit so you could comfortably worship your golden child without feeling guilty about completely ignoring your own daughter. You wanted me to pay a $50,000 dinner bill tonight just to publicly humiliate me. You mocked my car, my clothes, and my existence. You explicitly told me I belonged in the tiny guest quarters above the garage of a house that I actually own." I looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes, offering her absolutely no comfort. "You do not get to call me your favorite daughter just because my bank account suddenly has 10 zeros in it. You chose your golden child decades ago. Now you get to live with the devastating consequences of that choice." Gregory walked purposefully toward the head of the long mahogany table. He did not even acknowledge Richard or Derek. He looked only at me, giving a brief, highly respectful nod. "Good evening, Ms. Chief Executive Officer Gregory," said, his deep voice filling the silent dining room. "The perimeter is fully secure and the local authorities have been notified of the impending asset seizure as per your direct instructions." Local authorities. Richard choked out, his face turning a highly unhealthy, blotchy shade of purple. "What are you talking about? You cannot bring the police into a simple financial disagreement. We are a respectable, high society family. We can negotiate this privately behind closed doors." Gregory slowly turned his cold, calculating gaze toward my father. "There is nothing left to negotiate, Richard. Vanguard Apex does not negotiate with individuals who are in active and hostile default. We simply collect our legally binding assets. I am here strictly to serve you with the official legal notices regarding the immediate liquidation of your commercial properties, your corporate holdings, and your personal trust fund." Gregory placed his heavy black briefcase directly onto the center of the crisp white tablecloth. He popped the metal latches. The sharp mechanical snap echoed loudly in the quiet room like a gunshot. He reached inside and pulled out several thick stacks of legal documents, dropping them unceremoniously onto the table right next to the rejected credit cards and the utterly useless silver house key. Naomi leaned far away from the heavy stacks of paper, as if they were physically radioactive. She knew exactly what corporate death looked like. "Derek," she hissed through gritted teeth, her voice shaking with uncontained fury and rising panic. "Do something right now. Call your own lawyers. Do not just sit there and let her take everything we own." Derek tried to speak, but he just let out a pathetic stuttering sound. He looked at the massive mountain of legal paperwork, his golden child persona completely stripped away. He was nothing but a frightened little boy wearing an expensive suit he could no longer afford. "The total asset seizure is just the beginning of your problems tonight," I said softly, walking slowly toward the center of the room to stand right next to my lead attorney. "You see, when Oliver and my legal team began aggressively auditing the family trust fund last week, they uncovered something incredibly interesting." Gregory smoothly reached into the thick stack of legal paperwork and extracted a specific folder encased in bright red binding. He opened it and laid out several high-resolution copies of banking authorizations directly in front of my father. I watched Richard's eyes dart toward the papers, his face draining of whatever color had managed to return. When Vanguard Apex bailed out your failing logistics company 5 years ago, I established a blind trust to completely shield my identity. I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. As the sole guarantor, I was required to sign the initial funding agreement. However, federal financial regulations mandate that any active trust fund maintaining credit lines exceeding $10 million must be reauthorized annually. A physical signature from the guarantor is required every single year to verify the continued backing of the assets. Susan looked completely lost, her eyes darting between me and the lawyer. "I do not understand," she whispered. "If you were the anonymous guarantor, why did not you just sign the annual papers?" "Because I intentionally instructed my wealth management firm not to send them to me," I answered, looking directly at Richard. I wanted to see exactly how far my father would go to maintain his glorious illusion of wealth. I wanted to see if he would do the right thing and admit the company was failing, or if he would resort to highly illegal tactics to keep the money flowing. Gregory tapped a heavy silver pen against the bottom right corner of the top document. According to our exhaustive internal audit, he stated, his voice resonating with absolute legal authority. Richard bypassed the blind trust administrators entirely. To prevent the credit lines from being suspended, he intercepted the annual compliance forms. For the past 5 consecutive years, Richard has deliberately and fraudulently forged the signature of the primary guarantor on these federal banking documents. Naomi gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Forgery," she shrieked, looking at Richard with absolute horror. "You forged the signature of a billionaire guarantor just so you could keep paying for your country club memberships?" "It is much worse than simple forgery," Naomi Gregory corrected her sharply. "Because these fraudulent documents were subsequently transmitted across state lines to the corporate headquarters of Vanguard Apex in New York via electronic wire, each forged signature constitutes a direct violation of federal law. We are dealing with 5 distinct counts of aggravated identity theft and 5 distinct counts of federal wire fraud." Richard jumped up from his chair, pointing a violently shaking finger at the red folder. "That is a complete lie," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "I never signed her name. I signed as the primary beneficiary. I had the legal right to authorize the renewals. You are trying to frame me to steal my company." Gregory did not even flinch at the outburst. He simply turned the page. "The documents clearly display the forged signature of Natalie," he countered smoothly. "We have already submitted these documents to an independent forensic handwriting analyst. The expert concluded with absolute certainty that the fraudulent signatures were executed by the exact same hand that signed the primary corporate tax returns for your logistics company. Your hand, Richard." Derek looked like he was going to vomit. He gripped the edge of the table, staring at his father in complete disbelief. "Dad, tell me you did not do this," Derek pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Tell me you did not commit federal wire fraud. If the company is seized and you are indicted, I lose my executive title. My entire career is completely over." "Your career is the absolute least of his problems, Derek," I said coldly. "Under federal sentencing guidelines, a single count of wire fraud carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. My legal team has fully prepared a comprehensive evidence binder. It contains the forged documents, the digital timestamp logs, and the forensic handwriting analysis." Richard fell back into his chair as if he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. His chest heaved wildly. He looked at the documents, the undeniable proof of his own criminal arrogance staring right back at him. The aggressive titan of industry was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, broken old man, realizing he was about to lose his entire freedom. Susan began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest. "You cannot send your own father to prison, Natalie," she sobbed hysterically. "He is an old man. He will not survive in a federal facility. Just take the company and let the forgery go. Please show some basic human compassion." I looked down at her. Compassion is a luxury strictly reserved for those who actually deserve it. Compassion is a luxury strictly reserved for those who actually deserve it. I let the heavy words hang in the air, allowing the absolute finality of my statement to snuff out whatever tiny spark of hope Susan was still clinging to. She collapsed back into her chair, burying her perfectly contoured face in her trembling hands, her shoulders shaking with silent and heavy sobs. The matriarch, who had spent decades demanding perfection, was now completely shattered by her own family's corruption. Naomi, however, was not crying. Her sharp and calculating mind was already working overtime, rapidly processing the massive crater that had just been blasted into her carefully planned future. She looked at the bright red legal folder resting on the table, then at Richard's pale face, and finally at her own husband. Derek was completely paralyzed. He was staring at the federal fraud documents with a blank and vacant expression, his breathing shallow and incredibly rapid. As the vice president of the logistics company, his name was likely plastered all over those fraudulent accounts, even if Richard was the one physically signing the illegal papers. At the very least, Derek was now entirely unemployed, utterly broke, and publicly attached to a massive federal fraud scandal. Naomi slowly pushed her chair back. The scraping sound of the wooden legs against the imported marble floor was loud and harsh in the quiet dining room. She stood up, smoothing the front of her emerald silk designer gown with shaking hands. But the shaking was not from sorrow or fear. It was from pure, unadulterated rage. "You lied to me," Naomi whispered, her voice dangerously low and thick with venom. She took a slow step toward Derek, her eyes narrowing into sharp and deadly slits. "You sat there for 5 years and told me you were building a massive corporate empire. You told me you were a genius executive securing our future. But you are absolutely nothing. You are a complete fraud living off stolen money." Derek blinked slowly, looking up at his wife. The panic swimming in his bloodshot eyes was incredibly pathetic. "Naomi, please," he begged, reaching out to grab her hand. "We are in this together. We can hire a brilliant defense attorney. We can figure a way out of this terrible mess. I still have my elite connections." Naomi forcefully snatched her hand away, as if his touch physically burned her skin. She repeated, her voice rising in pitch, echoing sharply off the crystal chandeliers. "There is no we anymore, Derek. You are deeply implicated in a federal wire fraud investigation. Your arrogant father is going to a federal penitentiary, and the authorities are definitely going to aggressively audit every single executive at that failing company. You have absolutely zero connections left. Your entire professional network is going to completely distance themselves from you by tomorrow morning when this massive scandal officially breaks." She paced back and forth, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the floor. "I clawed my way up from nothing to get into these elite social circles," Naomi fumed, waving her manicured hands in the air. "I sacrificed my own time and energy to play the role of the perfect high society wife. I put up with your arrogant father and your suffocating mother because I thought there was a massive financial payoff. I thought I was securing true generational wealth. But you dragged me onto a sinking ship, covered in cheap gold paint. The federal government is going to freeze every single joint account we have. I am not going down with you." Derek looked like a deeply beaten dog. "Naomi, I swear I did not know about the forged signatures," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "I thought the money was entirely legitimate. I thought the business was actually thriving." "Ignorance is not a legal defense, Derek," Naomi snapped back, remaining absolutely merciless. "And even if you genuinely did not know, it just proves my point. You are completely incompetent. You are the vice president of a logistics company, and you did not even realize your own father was bankrupting the firm and committing federal crimes to keep the lights on. You are a pathetic excuse for a businessman, and you are a pathetic excuse for a husband." She stopped pacing and stood directly in front of him. She reached over with her right hand and tightly gripped the massive diamond engagement ring and the matching diamond wedding band resting on her left ring finger. With one swift and highly forceful motion, she pulled the heavy jewelry off her hand. Derek gasped loudly, his eyes widening in pure horror. "Naomi, what are you doing? Do not do this. Please, I love you." Naomi threw the expensive rings violently onto the crisp white tablecloth. The heavy diamonds clattered loudly, bouncing once before rolling to a complete stop right next to the rejected Black Centurion card and the useless silver key to the Beverly Hills mansion. It was the perfect visual representation of their entirely fabricated life, completely falling apart. "I am filing for divorce," Naomi announced, her voice cold and completely detached. "First thing tomorrow morning, my legal team is going to draw up the expedited papers. I am completely severing all ties with you and this deeply toxic criminal family. I will not let your massive failures drag my hard-earned reputation through the mud." She grabbed her designer clutch from the table, not even bothering to look at Susan or Richard. She turned her sharp gaze to me one last time. There was no more mockery in her eyes, only a begrudging and terrified respect. "You won, Natalie," she said flatly. "Enjoy the empire." Without another word, Naomi turned on her heel and marched directly toward the heavy wooden doors. She yanked them open and walked out of the private dining room, leaving her broken husband weeping softly at the dinner table. The sound of Derek crying was pathetic. It was a wet and heavy sobbing that completely destroyed whatever was left of his glorious golden child persona. He buried his face in his shaking hands, his tailored suit shifting awkwardly with every desperate heave of his shoulders. Richard remained completely frozen in his chair, staring blindly at the empty doorway where his daughter-in-law had just made her dramatic exit. The massive Beverly Hills estate, the booming family logistics company, and his entire patriarchal structure had completely evaporated in less than an hour. Then the faint and piercing wail of police sirens cut through the quiet atmosphere of the upscale neighborhood. The sound grew steadily louder and more distinct, rapidly approaching the front entrance of the exclusive restaurant. Brilliant flashes of red and blue light began to reflect aggressively against the sheer curtains of the private dining room windows, painting the terrified faces of my parents in harsh, alternating colors. Susan snapped her head toward the window, her eyes widening in absolute panic. "Richard, what is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. "Tell me those lights are not for us. Tell me this is just a terrible misunderstanding." Richard did not answer her. He simply could not speak. The heavy wooden doors swung open once again. This time it was not a waiter holding a leather folder. 3 uniformed police officers stepped into the room, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts, their expressions stern and strictly professional. They were followed closely by the restaurant manager, who looked both highly distressed and completely fascinated by the unfolding corporate drama. Gregory, my senior corporate counsel, stepped forward immediately to intercept them. He handed the lead officer a thick manila folder containing the expedited federal warrants and the local financial fraud complaints Vanguard Apex had filed just an hour prior. The officer quickly reviewed the top page, nodded respectfully to Gregory, and then turned his sharp, uncompromising gaze toward the head of the table. Richard and Derek, the officer, announced, his authoritative voice echoing loudly off the crystal chandeliers. "We have active felony warrants for your immediate arrest regarding multiple counts of corporate wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Please stand up slowly and place your hands directly behind your backs." Derek let out a loud and completely strangled scream. He scrambled backward in his wooden chair, pressing his body against the wall as if he could physically merge with the expensive wallpaper to escape his fate. "No, no, no!" Derek chanted hysterically. "There is a massive mistake here. I am just the vice president. I did not actually sign those banking papers. My dad did it. He forged everything behind my back. Take my dad. The sheer, unfiltered cowardice of his statement hung heavily in the air. The golden child, the perfect son they had worshipped for 35 years, was instantly and ruthlessly throwing his own father under the bus just to save his own skin. Richard slowly pushed himself up from his chair. His legs were visibly shaking, but he tried desperately to summon the absolute last remaining ounce of his shattered pride. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Richard demanded, pointing a trembling finger at the armed officers. "I am a highly respected titan of industry in this city. I pay more in taxes than your entire precinct receives in funding. You cannot barge into a private VIP dinner and treat me like a common street criminal. I demand to call my attorney right now." "You can make your phone call from the holding cell, sir," the lead officer replied coldly, stepping forward and firmly grabbing Richard by the arm. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back right now. If you resist arrest, we will add additional felony charges to your incredibly long list." Richard looked at the officer and then he looked directly over at me. His eyes were entirely hollow and utterly defeated. He finally realized that his massive arrogance had absolutely no currency left in the real world. He slowly turned around. The harsh metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly through the quiet room, sounding exactly like a definitive period at the end of his 40-year legacy. The second officer approached Derek, grabbing him roughly by the shoulder and pulling him forcefully to his feet. Derek did not even try to act tough. He completely fell apart. He looked across the table at me, thick tears streaming down his flushed face. "Natalie, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Tell them to stop this. I am your brother, we share the same blood. You cannot let them take me to a federal prison. I will do anything you want. I will clean your cars. I will work in the mailroom. Just stop them." I looked at my brother, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold and heavy satisfaction. "Half an hour ago, you eagerly offered me a job scrubbing your infinity pool for minimum wage, Derek," I said smoothly. "I highly suggest you get comfortable scrubbing the concrete floors of your new federal cell instead. Take them away, officers." Susan rushed forward, screaming and clawing wildly at the air, desperately trying to reach her husband and her sobbing son. "Stop it! Let them go!" she shrieked hysterically, her designer gown tangling around her legs. The third officer firmly pushed her back, warning her that she would be arrested for obstruction of justice if she interfered with the active warrant. She collapsed onto the expensive carpet, weeping uncontrollably. The officers escorted Richard and Derek out of the private dining room, but they did not take them out quietly through the back kitchen doors. They marched them directly through the center of the main dining area of the French Laundry. Every single elite patron in the restaurant, the exact same high society people who had just read the Forbes article about my billionaire status, watched in complete and absolute silence as the two arrogant men were paraded out in heavy steel handcuffs. It was the ultimate, inescapable public humiliation. They were entirely ruined, and everyone in the city now knew exactly why. They were entirely ruined, and everyone in the city now knew exactly why. I stood in the doorway of the private dining room, watching the flashing red and blue lights fade into the distance as the police cruisers rapidly pulled away from the restaurant. The heavy silence that settled over the space was no longer oppressive. It felt incredibly light, like a massive and violent storm had finally passed, leaving the air crisp and entirely clean. I turned my attention back to the center of the room. Susan was still sitting on the expensive imported carpet, clutching a torn linen napkin, her makeup completely smeared across her cheeks. She looked up at me, her eyes entirely hollow. She had spent her entire life worshiping the almighty dollar and the men she thought provided it. Now both the money and the men were completely gone, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of her own terrible choices. I looked down at the table one last time. The heavy silver key to the Beverly Hills mansion, my father's useless platinum credit card, and Naomi's discarded diamond wedding rings were left scattered across the white tablecloth. They were nothing but shiny, worthless artifacts of a completely fabricated empire that had just burned to the ground. "You could have saved us, Natalie," Susan whispered, her voice barely carrying across the room. "You have $40 billion. You could have paid the commercial loan. You could have easily made all of this go away and let us be happy. We are your family." I slowly walked over to the table and picked up my secure mobile device, sliding it safely back into my handbag. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely no resentment, no anger, and certainly no pity. I just felt a profound sense of permanent closure. "You stopped being my family a very long time ago, Mom," I replied softly, my voice perfectly steady. "Family is supposed to protect you. Family is supposed to build you up when the rest of the world tries to aggressively tear you down. But in this house, I was never a daughter. I was just a punching bag you used to make yourselves feel powerful. You worshipped Derek because he was exactly like you, greedy, arrogant, and completely empty inside. I did not destroy this family tonight. I simply held up a mirror and let you look at yourselves for the very first time." I turned my back on her for the final time and walked out of the private dining room. As I stepped into the main dining area of the French Laundry, a highly surreal thing happened. The incredibly wealthy patrons, the elite socialites and corporate executives who had just witnessed the spectacular downfall of my father, completely stopped talking. As I walked down the center aisle, they physically stepped aside, parting like the Red Sea to give me a clear path to the exit. They looked at me with a mixture of absolute awe and deeply rooted fear. They had read the Forbes article. They knew exactly who I was, and they knew exactly what I was capable of doing to anyone who crossed me. I pushed through the heavy glass front doors and stepped out into the cool California night air. Waiting for me at the edge of the valet curb was not the rusted Toyota I had driven here to complete my perfect disguise. It was a flawless midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom. My personal driver, a highly trained security professional, immediately stepped out and opened the heavy rear door for me with a respectful nod. "Good evening, Ms. Chief Executive Officer," he said smoothly. "Is everything concluded here?" "Yes," I replied, stepping into the incredibly plush interior of the luxury vehicle. "Everything is completely finished. Take me home." As the Rolls-Royce quietly pulled away from the curb, I looked out the tinted window and watched the glowing sign of the restaurant slowly disappear into the darkness. For 33 years, I had carried the heavy burden of my family's toxic expectations. But as I sat in the back of my car, heading back to the massive empire I had built with my own two hands, I finally realized the absolute truth. My worth was never determined by their inability to love me. Their devastating limitations were never my destiny. Have you ever had to walk away from a highly toxic family dynamic to save your own sanity? I would love to hear your personal stories of survival and success in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you tonight, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories about resilience, setting boundaries, and claiming your ultimate worth. Remember, you are entirely capable of writing your own ending, and your brilliant future does not have to include the people who kept you in the dark. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. The story of Natalie and her spectacular triumph over her deeply toxic family serves as a powerful reminder that our true worth is never dictated by the loud and arrogant opinions of those who refuse to see our value. For decades, her parents and her older brother tried to systematically shrink her into the role of a designated scapegoat. They used relentless mockery and cruel financial manipulation to make themselves feel incredibly superior. However, the most profound lesson woven through this narrative is not merely about executing a flawless financial revenge. It is about the immense and unbreakable power of quiet resilience. When you grow up in an environment that constantly diminishes your light, it is incredibly easy to internalize that toxic narrative and mistakenly believe you are simply a burden. Natalie chose a completely different and highly empowering path. She did not waste her precious energy screaming for their validation or begging for a seat at their heavily guarded table. Instead, she built her own massive empire in absolute silence. She deeply understood that true power does not need to boast or wear flashy designer clothes to prove it actually exists. Real power is knowing exactly who you are and possessing the quiet confidence to let your undeniable success speak for itself. Her journey teaches us that we absolutely do not have to accept the demeaning roles our dysfunctional families attempt to assign to us. We have the absolute right to walk away from tables where basic respect is no longer being served. We can choose to stop funding our own emotional destruction and start investing entirely in our own independent growth. The moment we stop desperately seeking the approval of people who are committed to misunderstanding us is the exact moment we become truly unstoppable. Take a moment today to evaluate the toxic relationships draining your energy and bravely take the first step toward building a life where your worth is fully recognized.